I never imagined I'd find myself driving through the Nevada desert alone at night. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. My sister had been in a bad car accident in Reno, and time was of the essence. Flights were either booked or far too expensive, so I grabbed my keys and set out from Las Vegas, determined to make the 7-hour drive in one go. The highway stretched out in front of me like an endless black ribbon, cutting through miles of empty desert. As the hours ticked by, I passed small, desolate towns like Beatty and Tonopah. By midnight, the scenery had melted into nothing but darkness and the cold shimmer of moonlight on the horizon. The temperature had dropped, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield as I kept driving. The occasional shadowy cactus whipped by, casting eerie silhouettes under my headlights. Around 2 a.m., I glanced at my gas gauge and realized it was dipping lower than I expected. I cursed myself for not filling up in Tonopah and eased off the gas, trying to conserve what little I had left. A few miles later, a sign appeared out of the darkness. Rest area, 5 miles. It was the only sign of life I had seen in hours, and I decided to pull over and take a quick break, hoping to stretch my legs and figure out my next move. The rest stop was barely more than a flickering streetlight and a couple of vending machines. A small, dilapidated building stood off to the side, its windows boarded up, as if it hadn't been used in years. I parked next to one of the vending machines, but when I tried to buy a bottle of water, the machine just ate my money. Frustrated, I leaned against my car, breathing in the cold desert air. That's when I heard it, a faint voice drifting through the wind. "Hello." I froze, looking around the empty lot. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, a little louder this time. "Can you help me?" My stomach dropped as I saw a figure emerge from the shadows, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. He was hunched over, shivering, his clothes ragged and worn. His face was gaunt and pale, eyes sunken into dark sockets that looked almost hollow. "I need help. My car broke down," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. He gestured out toward the desert beyond the rest area, but in the darkness I couldn't see any sign of a vehicle. A shiver ran down my spine, and I found myself backing toward my car, keeping my eyes on him. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. Why was he out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen a car for miles. My instincts told me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave without at least trying to figure out what was going on. "Where's your car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't see any vehicles on the way here." He pointed again into the darkness, but I still couldn't make out anything. "It's just over there, not far," he replied, his voice strange and uneven. He took a step closer, his movements jerky, almost unnatural. My pulse quickened. I can call for help when I get to the next town," I stammered, taking another step back. My car door was just a few feet behind me now. "You should wait here." But the man didn't stop. He took another step forward, his expression shifting into something desperate, his eyes wide and frantic. "Please, let me in your car," he said, his voice cracking. "It's so cold out here. You have to help me." I gripped my keys, the metal digging into my palm. Something inside me screamed to get away, to run. I took another step back, my heel hitting the car door. "I'm sorry, I can't," I muttered, fumbling for the handle. That's when he lunged. He moved faster than I thought possible, his arms outstretched as if to grab me. I yanked open the car door and scrambled inside, slamming it shut just as he reached the window. He pounded on the glass, his face inches from mine, his breath fogging up the window. "Let me in," "You have to let me in," he shouted, his voice filled with a manic urgency. I twisted the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning against the gravel as I backed away. The man kept up with me for a few steps, his hands clawing at the window, his face twisted with desperation. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped and fell to his knees, watching as I sped away into the night. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I drove for miles, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. The rest of the drive felt like a blur, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why was he so desperate to get into my car? When I finally reached Reno just before dawn, I went straight to the hospital. My sister was stable, and I spent the next few hours trying to calm myself down in the waiting room. When I eventually mentioned my strange encounter to one of the nurses, she went pale. "You're not the first person to see him," she said quietly. "A few travelers have reported a man like that, always near that rest stop. They say his car broke down years ago, but no one ever finds it." I couldn't sleep that night, replaying the encounter in my head. I could still see his eyes, wide and desperate, his breath fogging up my window, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had let him in, I might never have made it out of the desert. It was a night like any other on the desolate highways, and I'm Jake, a truck driver who's spent over a decade hauling cargo through these lonesome roads. The hum of the engine and the endless stretch of asphalt were my only companions. That night I found myself on a particularly eerie stretch, enveloped in an impenetrable fog that wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud. The dim glow of my headlights cut through the mist, and the rhythmic sound of raindrops pattered on the roof of my rig. I'd heard rumors on the SEAB radio about this stretch, a place where truckers whispered of abandoned cars and drivers who disappeared without a trace. It sent shivers down the spines of even seasoned drivers, but I had always dismissed such tales. Until that night. As I navigated the winding road, the fog thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The low hum of the engine faded into an oppressive silence, and shadows danced unnervingly in the night. Suddenly I saw a silhouette on the side of the road, a figure standing motionless in the fog. My instincts screamed to keep driving, but something compelled me to stop. I eased off the gas, and my truck rolled to a halt beside him. He looked oddly pale, the fog clinging to him like a ghostly cloak. But it was his eyes, big, round, and as black as the void, that sent a chill up my spine. His mouth gaped wide, stretching in a way that defied reason. Hesitation washed over me. Something was terribly wrong. The figure stood still, staring into the fog. My heart raced, and as I prepared to leave, I glanced back. That's when I noticed the twisted, grotesque smile curling on his featureless face. Panic surged, and I slammed on the gas, leaving him behind in a blur of fog. I grabbed the radio mic to share my unsettling encounter with fellow truckers, but to my dismay, the once busy airwaves were silent. The road felt endless as I pressed the accelerator harder, desperate to distance myself from that creature. But no matter how far I drove, the fog clung to me. After more than 100 miles, a lonely parking lot appeared, and I pulled over, weariness and fear clawing at me. I shut off the engine and tried to convince myself it was just fatigue. I locked the doors, closed the curtains, and nestled into my bunk, hoping the haunting image of the pale figure would fade. Sleep, however, eluded me. Hours passed, and a sense of impending doom jolted me awake. I opened the curtains to find the parking lot bathed in an eerie glow from flickering lamps, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the fog. And then I saw them. 3 of those nightmare creatures standing like sentinels, their dark eyes fixed on my truck. Panic gripped me as I turned on the cabin lights, revealing their ghastly features. Their mouths opened wide, emitting guttural growls that reverberated through the metal walls, filling the cabin with a thick, otherworldly presence. Desperation clawed at me as I reached for the ignition, praying the truck would roar to life. But it remained silent, as if rebelling against the terror that surrounded me. The creatures sensed my vulnerability and began to advance, gliding unnaturally across the asphalt, their growls intensifying. Just as they were about to reach me, relief surged through my veins as the engine finally roared to life. I slammed the gear into drive, jolting forward and leaving the grotesque figures behind. As I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that those creatures were not bound by the laws of reality. Their terrifying growls echoed in the distance, even as the city lights began to flicker on the horizon. I dared a glance back and was horrified to see them running after me with unnatural speed, as if shadows were chasing my truck. As I drove into the warmth of city lights, the creatures halted at the edge of the urban sprawl, their growls fading into the night. I parked in a well-lit area, trembling as I reached for the radio mic once more, hoping to connect with someone. But static filled the airwaves, drowning my pleas. I spent the restless hours of the night in that haven of civilization, the glowing lights pushing back the darkness. Yet no matter how bright the city shone, the images of those nightmarish creatures lingered in my mind. As dawn broke, I pulled back onto the road, unease gnawing at me. The city lights gradually faded in the rearview mirror as I entered another desolate stretch. My radio crackled to life, a voice breaking through the static. "Hey, you there? You okay?" The voice was concerned. I eagerly recounted the horrors I had faced, encounters with pale figures, a broken radio, and a relentless pursuit. A pause hung in the air before the voice replied, heavy with disbelief. "You're not alone. We've all heard those stories, the abandoned cars, the creatures in the fog, but we thought they were just tales." A chill ran down my spine as I realized I wasn't the only one. The radio buzzed with hushed conversations among truckers, sharing their own encounters with these supernatural beings. Each story varied, yet they all connected. Those creatures with their haunting eyes and twisted smiles were a malevolent force drawn to lonely roads at night. As I continued my journey, unease settled over me. The road stretched endlessly, the fog clinging to the highway like a specter. With each mile, the fear deepened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those creatures were watching, waiting for their next chance to strike. The radio chatter grew frantic, truckers exchanging advice on avoiding the creatures and recounting tales of those who vanished without a trace. The shared fear connected us all, a bond forged in the face of the unknown. Approaching the stretch where I first encountered the creatures, dread settled in. The fog thickened, heavy with unseen eyes. Then I realized the road was a loop, an unending circuit that brought travelers back to the heart of the supernatural. The camaraderie on the radio, the comforting city lights, all mere illusions meant to deceive. The creatures were not bound by distance. They were trapped in time, forever haunting the unwary. A guttural growl echoed through the fog, and the twisted figures reappeared. Their black eyes pierced my soul, and I slammed my foot on the gas, but the truck felt tethered to the nightmarish loop. As the creatures closed in, the fog swallowed everything, the road becoming an endless void. The last thing I saw were those eyes, an abyss consuming all light. The radio crackled one final time, terrified voices warning me, but it was too late. The creatures closed in, and the world descended into darkness. Thus, the haunted highway claimed another victim, lost to the eternal night, and the malevolent creatures lurking within the fog. The loop continued, an unending cycle of horror, trapping the unwary in an everlasting nightmare. The road stretched on, shrouded in fog, a haunted path few dared to traverse and even fewer escaped. Driving through Utah can be breathtaking, but there's one stretch of I-70 between Salina and Green River that is as daunting as it is beautiful. Over 100 miles with no services, no hotels, no gas stations, no restaurants, just stunning views during the day and an eerie isolation at night. The mountains look majestic under the sunlight, and at night the stars seem to stretch endlessly across the sky. But the idea of being stranded out there, especially in the dark, is unsettling. I had recently made the decision to drive this stretch, a choice made in haste. A call from my mother that Sunday afternoon at around 2 p.m. changed everything. My grandpa, who had been in a nursing home after a stroke, was getting worse. He didn't have much time left, and if I wanted to see him, I had to act quickly. With no job tying me down at the moment, and flights being pricey, I opted to drive from my home in Los Angeles back to Lincoln, Nebraska, where most of my family still lived. It wasn't the most enjoyable drive, but it was certainly cheaper. I was on the road with my dog, Chance, packed and ready for the journey ahead. The drive was mostly uneventful until I hit Utah, and as daylight faded, I felt disappointed that I was missing the scenery. I love stargazing, but I couldn't enjoy it while speeding down the highway. Instead, I cranked up the music and sang along loudly to keep myself awake. After a few hours, I finally arrived at Salina, where I stopped for gas. The sign loomed ahead, a warning that I was about to enter a desolate stretch. No bull, no service for 110 miles, it proclaimed. And it was true. I knew that people regularly found themselves stranded in that lonely stretch. I filled up my tank and hit the road, the air chilly and the landscape eerily quiet. The recent snowfall left a dusting on the sides of the road, contrasting sharply with the dark asphalt. The speed limit was 80 mph, and I found myself cruising closer to 90. But the deeper I drove into the night, the more I felt the isolation. It wasn't long before I realized I hadn't seen another car in a while. The darkness enveloped me, and I couldn't help but turn off my headlights for a moment, just to see what complete darkness looked like. It was unsettling but strangely peaceful. Suddenly a loud pop shattered the quiet. My car jerked to one side. I cursed under my breath as the low tire pressure indicator lit up. I pulled over to the shoulder, flicked on my hazard lights, and immediately felt Chance's anxiety spike. As I stepped out of the car, I found my front tire completely flat. I remembered how I had blown a tire before and knew what was coming. Checking my phone for service, of course, there was none. I rolled down the window for Chance to get some air while I tackled the tire. I grabbed the spare and jack from the trunk, but as I walked back around my car, something caught my eye. A figure was moving towards me. Just outside the reach of my headlights, my heart raced. I glanced at Chance, who had gone silent, his gaze fixed on the stranger. The figure was tall at least 6'5". A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't seen any headlights behind me for miles, and now this person just appeared out of nowhere. "Hello?" I called, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. No response. The figure stood completely still, staring at me, and I began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. My gut instinct screamed at me to get back in the car, lock the doors, but I was paralyzed by fear and curiosity. "Do you need help?" a voice finally asked, faint but distinct. I could tell it was a man, but his voice didn't match his size, too high, almost strained. He still hadn't moved. "Where did you come from?" I blurted out. "I didn't see any cars pass me. How long have you been out here?" I started to edge closer, gripping the tire iron tightly in my hand. "Do you need help?" he repeated, not moving an inch. There was something off about him. He didn't seem dressed for the freezing temperatures. I was bundled up, but he wore a short-sleeved shirt. His head was bowed, and I couldn't make out any features. As his voice grew more frantic, repeating the question over and over, panic surged through me. "Do you need help? Do you need help?" I backed away slowly, inching toward my driver's side door, the tire iron feeling more like a useless prop in this situation. Then, in an instant, headlights appeared behind me. Chance barked loudly, breaking the spell of silence. I turned back toward the figure, but he was gone. I shouted into the night, "Hello?" But there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I felt the weight of the encounter settling heavily on my chest. The car sped past without stopping, and I was left standing there, bewildered. Had I imagined it? I walked to where the figure had stood, and to my horror, I saw footprints in the snow. They began right where he had been and led off into the darkness. Curiosity pulled me to follow them, but common sense kicked in. Instead, I returned to my car, finished changing the tire, and resumed my journey, shaken but determined. The rest of the drive to Lincoln was quiet and uneventful, but that encounter haunted me. I didn't mention it to anyone. It felt too surreal. But even now, as I think back on that night, I can't shake the feeling of dread that settled in my bones. I know I don't want to drive that stretch of I-70 again at night, especially knowing there are things lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge.